sort of something you can fill out. It sort of will happen after it's finished, but just to highlight something, there's an email address on the bottom there, and what's going on tonight is actually being recorded. So if you want to show your friends or your mom or something after this is all over, yeah, maybe email down there. We're not going to spam you with anything. That's us just being real there. So yeah, if you happen to want the recording and stuff like that, and there's also we might need to contact you if you fill out, check out certain boxes and want to know certain things. But yeah, we're not going to spam you. Don't worry about it. It's going to be okay. So yeah, my name's Chris. I'm with the Christian Unity team here on campus. What that essentially is a conglomeration of all the different groups, and we do something usually about once a month. Normally it's called Unite the Light, but every so often we get really creative and lucky and do cool things like this. And we happen to have come in contact with a group called Faith Beyond Belief, which is a group that is super important to making this all go on. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Pastor Jonathan, who's going to come up here and just speak about Faith Beyond Belief.
Thank you. My name is John Ferguson. I'm on the board of directors with Faith Beyond Belief, which is a local organization that is dedicated to helping Christians understand, articulate, and defend the Christian worldview. We are putting on a conference this weekend at Center Street, and Dr. William Lane Craig is one of the speakers there. And we were kind enough, or he was kind enough, I should say, to take an extra evening and come out here to the University of Calgary. At Faith Beyond Belief, we love to promote debate and free inquiry. A couple years ago, we co-sponsored with the Free Thinkers here at the University of Calgary debate with Greg Kokel of Stand to Reason and Professor John Baker, who's professor here of philosophy, on the issue, does objective morality exist? In 2011, with the Free Thinkers as well, we sponsored an evening with Canada's own Dr. Craig Evans, who's a New Testament authority, and he spoke on the historical reliability of the Gospels. And so we're glad tonight to be able to co-sponsor with the Christian Unity team tonight's presentation with Dr. William Lane Craig. Let me have the honor of introducing him. Dr. Craig is the research professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology in California. He has earned PhDs, one in philosophy from the University of Birmingham in England, as well as in theology from the University of Munich in Germany. He has authored or co-edited over 30 books, including The Kalam Cosmological Argument, Theism, Atheism, and Big Bang Cosmology, Time and Eternity, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, and Assessing the New Testament Evidence for the History of the Resurrection of Jesus. He's written over 100 articles in professional journals of philosophy and theology, such as the Journal of Philosophy, the American Philosophical Quarterly, Philosophical Studies, and the British Journal for Philosophy and Science. Dr. Craig is the head of an organization called Reasonable Faith, and you can find out more information at reasonablefaith.org. He's a much sought-after speaker and lecturer, and he's debated a number of leading thinkers, including recently Dr. Lawrence Krauss and Dr. Alex Rosenberg, as well as other thinkers such as Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens. In just a moment, we're going to welcome him up, but I just need to make a couple comments. Don't forget the comment cards that are available. There'll be a box in the back that you can drop those off in at the end of the service. Also, if you're interested in helping your friends know that this is going on tonight, it is being produced live on the internet even as we speak. If you want to tweet the address to your friends, this is it. It's WLC, the initials of our speaker, WLC.livemegavideo.com. There are a number of folks who weren't able to get in here this evening, and we like to have as many people who are interested to be able to jump in on this. And so, without further ado, on this cold Calgary evening, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. William Lane Craig.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here with you this evening. As you know, I'm in town for the conference, But the opportunity to speak at Calgary University, once again, is just irresistible to me. It was at Calgary back in 1982 that I had my first campus debate with Kai Nielsen on the existence of God, and that launched a series of debates and speaking engagements really across the world. And so I'm really delighted to be back at Calgary and have this evening with you. And I want to thank all of the various Christian groups for sponsoring tonight's event, and thank the Free Thinkers as well for helping to promote it. Is the material world all there is? The view that there is nothing apart from the material world goes by a number of different names. Materialism, physicalism, naturalism would be a few. David Armstrong, a prominent naturalistic philosopher, characterizes naturalism in the following way. Naturalism, he says, is the doctrine that reality consists of nothing but a single, all-embracing, spatio-temporal system. According to this view, then, all that exists is the physical contents of time and space. Now, the question before us this evening is that true? Is there nothing but the physical objects existing in time and space? Tonight, I'd like to look at some reasons to think that that may not be the case. I believe that there are certain aspects of reality that we encounter in our experience of the world that suggest that the physical world is not all there is. These serve as signposts of transcendence, as it were, pointing beyond the natural world to its ground in a transcendent reality. Apart from some overriding reason to think that naturalism is true, I think we have to be open to the possibility of such a transcendent reality. We can't justifiably close our minds in advance to such a reality. As Shakespeare's Hamlet put it, there may be more things in heaven and on earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. So tonight, I want to sketch briefly 7 aspects of the world which suggest that there are indeed more things in heaven and on earth than are dreamt of in the naturalistic philosophy. Whole books have been written on each one of these, so in the brief time that I have, I can only sketch each aspect for you, and then during the Q&A time after the talk, we can go into more depth on any of them that you'd like to discuss further. Number 1 then, why anything at all exists. This is the deepest question of philosophy. The great Greek philosopher Aristotle said that the question why the world exists lay at the very root of philosophy, and it is one which thoughtful naturalists cannot avoid. Derek Parfit, for example, agrees that no question is more sublime than why there is a universe, why there is anything rather than nothing. Experience teaches that, premise 1, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. This principle seems quite plausible, at least more so than it's contradictory. Imagine that you were walking through the woods and came upon a ball lying on the ground. You would naturally wonder how it came to be there. If your hiking partner said to you, "Forget about it, it just exists inexplicably," you wouldn't take that seriously. You would find his claim quite bizarre and probably figure that he just wanted you to keep moving. You wouldn't take seriously the idea that the ball literally exists with no explanation of its existence. Now, notice that merely increasing the size of the ball, even until it becomes coextensive with the universe, does nothing to provide or remove the need for an explanation of its existence. According to this first principle, then, everything that exists is one of either 2 types. The first type is something that exists necessarily by its own nature. Examples? Well, many mathematicians believe that numbers, sets, and other abstract objects exist in this way. If such entities exist, they just exist necessarily without any cause of their being. The other type is anything that has an external cause of its existence. Examples? Mountains, planets, galaxies, people. They have causes outside themselves which explain why they exist. Now, it's obvious that, too, the universe exists, whereby the universe, I mean all of space-time reality. It therefore follows logically that the universe has an explanation of its existence. But what sort of explanation could the universe have? Well, it seems plausible that three. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is an external, transcendent, personal cause. Why? Because the cause of the universe must be greater than the universe. Think of the universe, all of space and time. So the cause of the universe must be beyond space and time. Therefore, it cannot be physical or material. Now, what sort of entity could that be? Well, there are only two candidates that I can think of that would fit that description. Either an abstract object, like a number, or else an unembodied mind or consciousness. But abstract objects can't cause anything. That's part of the definition of what it means to be abstract. The number 7, for example, has no effect upon anything. Therefore, it follows logically the explanation of the universe is an external, transcendent, personal cause. That is to say, there exists an unembodied mind which created the universe, which is what most people have traditionally meant by the word God. So, it seems to me that this is a sound argument for thinking that the explanation why anything at all exists is to be found in a personal, transcendent mind which is necessary in its existence and which is the cause of the contingent universe. Number 2, the origin of the universe. Have you ever asked yourself where the universe came from? Was there a beginning to the universe? Or does it just go back and back forever? Typically, naturalists have said that the universe is just eternal, and that's all. But there are good reasons, both philosophical and scientific, to doubt that this is the case. Philosophically, the idea of an infinite past seems absurd. If the universe never had a beginning, that means that the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But the real existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to metaphysical absurdities. For example, suppose you had an actually infinite number of coins, numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on to infinity. And I took away all the odd-numbered coins. How many coins would you have left? Well, you'd still have all the even-numbered coins, right? So, an infinity of coins. So infinity minus infinity is infinity. But now, let's suppose instead that I took away all of the coins greater than 4. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on. Now how many coins do you have left? Well, 3. So infinity minus infinity is 3. And yet, in each case, I took away an identical number of coins from an identical number of coins, and came up with contradictory results. In fact, you can subtract infinity from infinity and get any answer from 0 to infinity. This shows, I think, that infinity is just an idea or concept in your mind, not something that exists in reality. David Hilbert, who was perhaps the greatest mathematician of the 20th century, states, "The infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea." But that entails that since past events are not just ideas, but are real, the number of past events must be finite. Therefore, the series of past events can't go back forever. Rather, the universe must have begun to exist. This conclusion has been confirmed by remarkable discoveries in astronomy and astrophysics. In one of the most startling developments of modern science, we now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning about 13.7 billion years ago in a cataclysmic event known as the Big Bang. What makes the Big Bang so startling is that it represents the origin of the universe from literally nothing. For all matter and energy, even physical space and time themselves, came into being at the Big Bang. As the physicist P.C.W. Davies explains, the coming into being of the universe, as discussed in modern science, but literally the coming into being of all physical things from nothing. Of course, alternative theories have been crafted over the years to try to avoid this absolute beginning. But none of these theories has commended itself to the scientific community as more plausible than theories featuring a beginning. In fact, in 2003, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to prove that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion, cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. Last spring, at a conference at Cambridge University, celebrating the 70th birthday of Stephen Hawking, Vilenkin delivered a paper entitled "Did the Universe Have a Beginning?", in which he surveyed current cosmology with respect to this question. He concluded, and I quote, "None of these scenarios can actually be past eternal." He concluded, all the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning. Now that's a remarkable statement. Vilenkin does not say that the evidence for a beginning outweighs the evidence against a beginning. Rather, he says that all the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning. Vilenkin pulls no punches. He writes, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning." That problem was nicely captured by Anthony Kenny of Oxford University. He writes, "A proponent of the Big Bang theory, at least if he is an atheist, must believe that the universe came from nothing and by nothing." Now, Kenny was speaking of the Standard Model, but his conclusion applies with equal force to non-standard models as well. The problem is that such a conclusion is, in the words of the German philosopher of science, Baron of Kanitscheide, in head-on collision with the most successful ontological commitment in the history of science, namely the metaphysical principle that out of nothing, nothing comes. So, why does the universe exist instead of just nothing? Where did it come from? There must have been some sort of cause which brought the universe into being. We can summarize our argument thus far as follows. 1, if the universe began to exist, then the universe had a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. Given the truth of the two premises, the conclusion necessarily follows. But what sort of cause could this be? Well, from the very nature of the case, if what I've said is correct, this cause must be an uncaused, changeless, timeless, and immaterial being which created the universe. It must be uncaused because we've seen that there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. So we must come to an absolutely first uncaused cause. It must be timeless and therefore changeless, at least without the universe, since it created time. Because it also created space, it must transcend space as well. Therefore, it must be immaterial, not physical. Moreover, I would argue this cause is also plausibly personal. Just ask yourself the question, how else could a timeless cause give rise to a temporal effect like the universe? If the cause were a mechanically operating set of necessary and sufficient conditions, then the cause could never exist without its effect. Let me illustrate the point. The cause of water's freezing is the temperatures being below 0 degrees centigrade. If the temperature were below 0 degrees from eternity past, then any water that was around would be frozen from eternity past. It would be impossible for the water just to begin to freeze a finite time ago. So if the cause is permanently present, then its effect should be permanently present as well. So, in the case of the universe, how can the cause be timeless and its effect begin to exist only a finite time ago? It seems to me that the only way out of this dilemma is if the cause is a personal agent endowed with freedom of the will, who can freely choose to create an effect in time without any prior determining conditions. For example, a man sitting from eternity could freely will to stand up, and thus you would have a temporal effect arise from an eternal cause. And thus we are brought not merely to a transcendent cause of the universe, but to its personal creator. Number 3, the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. During the last 50 years or so, scientists have been stunned by the discovery that the existence of intelligent, interactive life depends upon a complex and delicate balance of initial conditions given in the Big Bang itself. Scientists once believed that whatever the initial conditions of the universe might have been, eventually intelligent life with some luck might evolve. But we now know, to the contrary, that our existence is balanced on a knife's edge of incomprehensible fineness. The existence of intelligent life depends upon a conspiracy of initial conditions which must be fine-tuned to a degree that is literally incomprehensible and incalculable. This fine-tuning is of two sorts. First, when the laws of nature are expressed as mathematical equations, you find appearing in them certain constants, like the gravitational constant. These constants are not determined by the laws of nature. The laws of nature are consistent with a wide range of values of these constants. Second, in addition to these constants, there are certain arbitrary quantities which are just put in as initial conditions on which the laws of nature operate. For example, the amount of entropy in the early universe. Now, all of these constants and quantities fall into an extraordinarily narrow range of life-permitting values. Were any of these constants or quantities to be altered by less than a hair's breadth, the life-permitting balance would be destroyed and life would not exist. Now, there are three possibilities proposed in the literature for explaining the presence of this remarkable fine-tuning of the universe. Physical necessity, chance, or design. The first alternative, physical necessity, holds that there is some unknown theory of everything which would explain why the universe is the way it is. It had to be that way, and there was really no chance, or little chance, of the universe's not being life-permitting. By contrast, the second alternative states that the fine-tuning is due entirely to chance. It's just an accident that the universe is life-permitting, and we're the lucky beneficiaries. The third alternative rejects both of these accounts in favor of an intelligent mind behind the cosmos, who designed the universe to permit life. The question is, which of these alternatives is the most plausible? Well, the first alternative seems extraordinarily implausible because, as we've seen, the constants and quantities are independent of the laws of nature. The laws of nature are consistent with a wide range of values of these constants and quantities. For example, the most promising candidate for a theory of everything to date, superstring theory, or M theory, allows for a cosmic landscape of around 10 to the 500th power different possible universes governed by the present laws of nature, so that it does nothing to render the observed values of the constants and quantities physically necessary. So what about that second alternative, that the fine-tuning of the universe is due to chance? Well, the problem with this alternative is that the odds against the universe's being life-permitting are so incomprehensibly great that they cannot be reasonably faced. Even though there may be a huge number of life-permitting universes lying within the cosmic landscape, nevertheless, the proportion of life-permitting worlds will be unfathomably tiny compared to the entire landscape, so that a dart randomly thrown at the cosmic landscape would have no meaningful chance of striking a life-permitting world. In order to rescue the alternative of chance, its proponents have therefore been forced to adopt the remarkable hypothesis that there exists an infinite number of randomly ordered universes, undetectable by us, composing a sort of world ensemble or multiverse of which our universe is but a part. Somewhere in this infinite world ensemble, finely tuned universes will appear by chance alone, and we happen to be in one such world. There are, however, at least two major weaknesses with the world ensemble hypothesis. First, there's no independent evidence that such a world ensemble exists. No one knows if there are other universes at all, much less that they are randomly ordered and infinite in number. Moreover, recall that Bohr, Guth, and Vilenkin proved that any universe which is in a state of cosmic expansion, on average over its history, cannot be infinite in the past. Their theorem applies to the multiverse 2. Therefore, since its past is finite, only a finite number of other universes may have been generated by now, so there's no guarantee whatsoever that a finely tuned world will have appeared anywhere in the ensemble. Secondly, and more fundamentally, if our universe is just a random member of an infinite world ensemble, then it is overwhelmingly more probable that we should be observing a much different universe than the one we in fact observe. Roger Penrose of Oxford University has stated this problem forcefully. He calculates that it's inconceivably more probable that our solar system should suddenly form by the random collision of particles than that a finely tuned universe should exist. In fact, Penrose calls it utter chicken feed by comparison. So, if our universe were just a random member of a world ensemble, it is inconceivably more probable that we should be observing a patch of order no larger than our solar system. For there are far more observable universes in the world ensemble in which our solar system comes to exist instantaneously through the accidental collision of particles than universes which are finely tuned for intelligent life. Indeed, the most probable observable universe is one in which a single brain fluctuates into existence out of the quantum vacuum and observes its otherwise empty world. Observable universes like those are simply much, much more plenteous in the world ensemble than worlds like ours, and therefore ought to be observed by us. Since we do not have such observations, that fact strongly disconfirms the world ensemble hypothesis. On naturalism, then, I think it is highly probable that there is no world ensemble. It seems then that 2, the fine-tuning is not due to physical necessity or chance, from which it follows logically that 3, therefore, it is due to design. Therefore, we ought to prefer the hypothesis of design, unless the design hypothesis can be shown to be just as implausible as its rivals. Detractors of design do sometimes object that on this hypothesis, the cosmic designer himself remains unexplained. Richard Dawkins calls this the central argument of his book, The God Delusion. It's said that an intelligent mind also exhibits a complex order, so that if the universe needs an explanation, so does its designer. If the designer does not need an explanation, why think that the universe does? This objection, however, is based upon a misconception of the nature of explanation. It is an elementary point in the philosophy of science that in order to recognize an explanation as the best, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. For example, if astronauts were to find a pile of machinery on the backside of the moon, they would recognize that it was the product of intelligent agents, even if they had no idea whatsoever who made it or who left it there. In order to recognize an explanation as the best, you don't need an explanation of the explanation. In fact, when you think about it, such a requirement would lead immediately to an infinite regress of explanations, so that nothing could ever be explained and science would be destroyed. For before any explanation could be acceptable, you'd need to have an explanation of the explanation. But before you could accept the explanation of the explanation, you'd need an explanation of the explanation of the explanation. And before you could accept the explanation of the explanation of the explanation, you'd need an explanation of the explanation of the explanation of the explanation. And before you could accept that, well, you see where this is leading. Nothing could ever be explained. So, in the case at hand, in order to recognize that design is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe, one needn't be able to explain the designer. Whether the designer has an explanation can simply be left as an open question for future inquiry. Moreover, the complexity of a mind is not really analogous to the complexity of the universe. A mind's ideas may be complex. Remarkably simple thing, being an immaterial entity not composed of pieces or separable parts. Moreover, properties like intelligence, consciousness, and volition are not contingent properties which a mind might lack, but are essential to its nature, and thus postulating an uncreated mind behind the cosmos is not at all like postulating an undesigned cosmos with all of its contingent and variegated quantities and constants. Number 4, objective moral values and duties in the world. If naturalism is true, then it is plausible that objective moral values and duties do not exist. To say that there are objective moral values is to say that something is good or bad, right or wrong, independently of whether anybody believes it to be so. It is to say, for example, that Nazi anti-Semitism was morally wrong even though the Nazis who carried out the Holocaust thought that it was good. And it would still be wrong even if the Nazis had won World War II and succeeded in exterminating or brainwashing everybody who disagreed with them so that everyone thought the Holocaust was good. And the claim is that in the absence of God, moral values and duties are not objective in this sense. So, premise 1, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Many theists and atheists alike concur on this point. For example, Michael Ruse, a Canadian philosopher of science, explains, and I quote, "Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, 'Love thy neighbor as thyself,' they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory." Friedrich Nietzsche, the great 19th century atheist who proclaimed the death of God, understood that the death of God meant the advent of nihilism, that is to say, the destruction of all meaning and value in life. I think that Friedrich Nietzsche was right. But we've got to be very careful here. The question before us is not, must we believe in God in order to live moral lives? I'm not claiming that we must. Nor is the question, can we recognize objective moral values without believing in God? I certainly think that we can. Rather, the question is, if God does not exist, do objective moral values and duties exist? And like Ruse, I just don't see any reason to think that in the absence of God, human morality is objective. After all, given a naturalistic view, what's so special about human beings? They're just accidental byproducts of nature which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe in which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On the naturalistic view, some actions, say rape, may not be socially advantageous. And so, in the course of human evolution, it has become taboo. But that does absolutely nothing to show that rape is really wrong. On the naturalistic view, apart from the social consequences, there's nothing really wrong with your raping someone. Thus, without God, there is no absolute right and wrong which imposes itself on our conscience. But the problem is that, too, objective moral values and duties do exist. In moral experience, we apprehend a realm of moral values and duties that impose themselves upon us. There's no more reason to deny the reality of moral values than the objective reality of the physical world around us. Just as in the absence of some defeater, we are rational to trust the deliverances of our five senses that there really is a world of physical objects out there, so in the absence of some defeater, we are rational to trust the deliverances of our moral apprehensions. And there is no such defeater. The reasoning of Michael Ruse at best proves that our subjective perception of moral values has evolved. But if moral values are gradually discovered rather than gradually invented, then our gradual and fallible apprehension of the moral realm no more undermines the objective reality of that realm than our gradual, fallible apprehension of the physical world undermines the objectivity of that realm. As the philosopher Louise Anthony put it so nicely, any argument for moral skepticism will be based upon premises which are less obvious than the reality of objective moral values themselves. And therefore, moral skepticism could never be rationally justified. And surely we do apprehend such objective values. Actions like rape, torture, child abuse aren't just socially unacceptable behavior. They're moral abominations. Some things, at least, are really wrong. Ironically, Michael Ruse himself confesses, and I quote, "The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. Here, Ruse equates the certainty with which we grasp certain moral truths with the logical certainty with which we grasp mathematical truths of elementary arithmetic. By the same token, love, equality, and self-sacrifice are really goods. But if objective moral values and duties cannot exist without God, and objective moral values and duties do exist, then it follows logically and inescapably that 3, therefore, God exists. And thus we have good moral grounds for belief in God's existence. Number 5. The very possibility of God's existence implies that God exists. I don't often share this argument in public not because I think it's unsound, but because it's so abstract that students are apt to think either that it's a trick or they don't understand it. But tonight I'm going to take a risk and share it with you. Now, in order to understand this argument, you need to understand what philosophers mean by possible worlds. A possible world is just a way the world might have been. It's a complete description of reality. So, a possible world is not a planet or a universe or any kind of concrete object. It's just a world description. The actual world is the description that is true. Other possible worlds are descriptions that are not in fact true, but might have been true. To say that something exists in some possible world is to say that there's some possible description of reality that includes that entity. To say that something exists in every possible world means that no matter which description is true, the entity will be included in that description. So, for example, unicorns do not in fact exist, but there is some possible world in which unicorns exist. On the other hand, many mathematicians think that numbers exist in every possible world. Now, with that in mind, consider the ontological argument, which was discovered in 1011 by the monk Anselm of Canterbury. God, Anselm observes, is by definition the greatest being conceivable. If you could think of anything greater than God, then that would be God. Thus, God is the greatest conceivable being, a maximally great being. So, what would such a being be like? Well, he would be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, and he would exist in every logically possible world. A being which lacked any of those properties would not be maximally great. We could conceive of something greater. But what that implies is that if God's existence is even possible, then God must exist. For if a maximally great being exists in any possible world, he exists in all of them. That's part of what it means to be maximally great, to be all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good in every logically possible world. So, if God's existence is even possible, then he exists in every logically possible world, and therefore in the actual world. We can summarize this argument as follows. Premise 1. It is possible that a maximally great being, aka God, exists. 2. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. 3. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. 4. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. 5. Therefore, a maximally great being exists in the actual world. 6. Therefore, a maximally great being exists. 7. Therefore, God exists. Now, it might come as a surprise to you to learn that steps 2 to 7 of this argument are relatively uncontroversial. Most philosophers would agree that if God's existence is even possible, then he must exist. So, the whole question is premise 1. Is God's existence possible? Well, what do you think? The atheist has to say that it's impossible that God exists. He has to maintain that the concept of God is incoherent, like the concept of a married bachelor or a round triangle. But the problem is that the concept of God just doesn't appear to be incoherent in that way. The idea of a being which is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good in every possible world seems perfectly coherent. Moreover, as we've seen, there are other arguments for God's existence which at least suggest that it's possible that God exists. So I'll simply leave it to you. Do you think, as I do, that it's at least possible that God exists? If you do, then it follows logically that God does exist. Number 6. The historical facts concerning the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, was by all accounts a remarkable individual. New Testament historians have reached something of a consensus that the historical Jesus came on the scene with an unprecedented sense of divine authority, the authority to stand and speak in God's place. That's why the Jewish leadership instigated his crucifixion on the charge of blasphemy. He claimed that in himself the kingdom of God had come. And as visible demonstrations of this fact, he carried out a ministry of miracle working and exorcisms. But the supreme confirmation of his claim was his resurrection from the dead. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, then it would seem that we have a divine miracle on our hands, and thus evidence for the existence of God. Now, most people would probably think that the resurrection of Jesus is something you just accept on faith or not. But as a result of my studies at the University of Munich, I found that there are actually 3 established facts which are recognized by the majority of New Testament historians today, which I believe are best explained by the resurrection of Jesus: his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. Let me just say a word briefly about each one of these. Fact number 1, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers on the Sunday morning after his crucifixion. According to Jakob Kramer, an Austrian scholar who has specialized in this area, and I quote, "By far, most scholars hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb," end quote. According to D.H. Van Dalen, it is extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb on historical grounds. Those who deny it, he says, do so on the basis of theological or philosophical assumptions. Fact number 2, on separate occasions, different individuals and groups saw appearances of Jesus alive after his death. According to Gerhard Lüdemann, a prominent skeptical German New Testament critic, and I quote, "It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ." These appearances were witnessed not only by believers, but also by unbelievers, skeptics, and even enemies. Fact number 3, the original disciples suddenly came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. Think of the situation the disciples faced following Jesus' crucifixion. Number 1, their leader was dead, and Jewish messianic expectations included no idea of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be shamefully executed by them as a criminal. Second, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the general resurrection at the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples suddenly came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead that they were willing to die for the truth of that belief. Luke Johnson, who is a New Testament scholar at Emory University, states, "Some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was." And N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, concludes, "That is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him." Attempts to explain away these 3 great facts, like the disciples stole the body or Jesus wasn't really dead, have been universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The simple fact is that there just is no plausible, naturalistic explanation of these facts. And therefore, it seems to me, the Christian is amply justified in believing that Jesus rose from the dead and therefore was who he claimed to be. But that entails that God exists. We can summarize this argument as follows. 1, there are 3 established facts concerning the fate of Jesus of Nazareth: the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of his disciples' belief in his resurrection. 2, the hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, is the best explanation of these facts. 3, the hypothesis, God raised Jesus from the dead, entails that the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists. 4, therefore, the God revealed by Jesus of Nazareth exists. And thus we have a good inductive argument for the existence of God from Jesus' resurrection. Finally, number 7, the personal experience of God. This last point isn't really an argument for God's existence. Rather, it's the claim that you can know that God exists wholly apart from arguments, simply by immediately experiencing him. This was the way that people in the Bible knew God. As Professor John Hick explains, and I quote, God was known to them as a dynamic will interacting with their own wills, a sheer given reality, as inescapably to be reckoned with as destructive storm and life-giving sunshine. They did not think of God as an inferred entity, but as an experienced reality. To them, God was not an idea adopted by the mind, but an experiential reality which gave significance to their lives. Philosophers call beliefs like this properly basic beliefs. They aren't based on some other beliefs. Rather, they're part of the foundation of a person's system of beliefs. Other properly basic beliefs would include the belief in the reality of the past, the existence of the external world, and the presence of other minds like your own. When you think about it, none of these beliefs can be proved by argument. How could you prove that the world was not created 5 minutes ago with built-in appearances of age, like food in our stomachs from the dinners we never really ate, or memory traces in our brains of events we never really experienced? How could you prove that you are not a brain in a vat, being stimulated with electrodes by some mad scientist to believe that you're here in this auditorium listening to this lecture? How could you prove that the other people around you are not really androids who exhibit all of the external behavior of people with minds, when in reality they are soulless, robot-like entities? She thinks her boyfriend is like that, I can tell. We don't base such beliefs on argument. Rather, they're part of the foundation of our system of beliefs. But although these beliefs are basic for us, that doesn't mean that they're arbitrary. Rather, they are grounded in the sense that they are formed in the context of certain experiences. In the experiential context of seeing and hearing and feeling things, I naturally form the belief that there are certain physical objects around me which I am sensing. Thus, my basic beliefs are not arbitrary, but they are appropriately grounded in experience. There may be no way to prove such beliefs, yet it's perfectly rational to hold them. You'd have to be crazy to think that you're a brain in a vat, or that the world was created 5 minutes ago. Such beliefs are not merely basic, they are properly basic. Now, in exactly the same way, belief in God is for those who seek him a properly basic belief grounded in our experience of God. We can summarize this as follows. Beliefs which are appropriately grounded may be rationally accepted as basic beliefs, not grounded on argument. 2, The belief that the biblical God exists is appropriately grounded. 3, therefore, belief that the biblical God exists may be rationally accepted as a basic belief not grounded on argument. Now, if this is right, then there's a danger that arguments for God's existence could actually distract your attention from God himself. The Bible promises, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. We mustn't so focus on the external arguments that we fail to hear the inner voice of God speaking to our own hearts. For those who listen, God becomes a personal reality in their lives. So, in summary, we've seen 7 features of the world around us that point beyond the world to its ground in a transcendent reality. The contingency argument, why anything at all exists. The cosmological argument, from the origin of the universe. The teleological argument, based on the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. The moral argument, from objective moral values and duties in the world. The ontological argument, based upon the very possibility of God's existence. The resurrection of Jesus. And finally, the personal experience of God. Is the material world all there is? I think that together these 7 reasons constitute a powerful cumulative case for thinking that the answer is no. And for that reason, I am enthusiastically a Christian theist.
So before we move into Q&A, we're just going to take a very short break to just make sure everything's set up and ready to go for that. Just to let you know, there's water over there if you're thirsty. Keep hydrated, it's important. Yeah, so we will be back in just a moment. Don't go anywhere. But yeah, get hydrated if you need to. And there's also, for your comment cards, in the back, there's a bin there. Send them in.
So if you repeat the questions here, everybody will hear.
Are allowed to clarify something.
They can't hear them,
We don't want to start any
can't hear that.
anything like that, and we don't want to take too much time. So again, you can ask a question and then also just a clarifying statement as well. And yeah, please keep your questions on topic. I'm sure we all want to know what Dr. Craig's favorite hockey team is, but that's not really relevant. Anyway, so if you have a question, please, in the most orderly Canadian way possible, line up at that mic right there, and yeah, we'll get things going. And if there happens to be too many questions and we can't get to all, I just want to apologize, but yeah, we've got to stick to the schedule here.
All right, thank you. Good. I've been asked to repeat the question for those who are watching online.
Okay, so my first part of my question is there is a group of logicians working at the University of Pittsburgh on an extension of temporal logic called step logic, where they give a more broad definition of agent than an abstract object like a number or a personal being. So I just thought you might want to look into that. And also
What's it called? I'm not familiar with it. How do you spell that? Excuse me? S-T-I-T. All right. Uh-huh.
And my actual question is, in the ontological argument, you use the modal axiom S5, which states that it's possible that X implies that it's necessary that it's possible that X. And my question is why you assume standard modal logic, which
Why do I assume standard S5 modal logic in the ontological argument? Simply because it is standard. I think it's the most plausible modal system, that what is possible doesn't vary from world to world. So if something is possible in one possible world, it's going to be possible in other worlds. So I think this is a relatively uncontroversial feature of the argument. I think the detractor would have to offer some pretty good argument for why we shouldn't accept S5, if that's his way of avoiding the argument. Yes, thank you.